Howdy. Good morning. I hope this video finds you alive and well, progressing through the course. A good clip. In this video, I want to discuss how to incorporate opposing arguments into your essay. Again, we're in the Files tab of our class. And if you scroll down there are a couple documents here. Responding to opposing arguments is the one that I'll spend the most time on today. We've been talking about the rhetorical situation, the expanded rhetorical situation, balancing ethos, pathos, and logos, or balancing your message, your logic, and your emotions, your appeal to emotions, the audience's emotions. You need to balance those things. And when it comes to ethos, the writer's credibility, ignoring opposing viewpoints in a university level academic essay damages your credibility. Just as we see politicians or pundits on television ignoring opposing viewpoints, when we see bias in the media, generally it's because they are ignoring opposing viewpoints. They're not listening with an open mind. Right? They're not addressing opposing viewpoints, or they're not entering the discussion of opposing viewpoints for legitimate reasons. So you need to be better than that, right? You need to introduce opposing arguments. You can't ignore them. That damages your credibility. But when you respond to those opposing arguments, the most important part of that response is refuting them. Okay? So we have some examples here. Responding to opposing arguments, anticipating possible objections. Ask yourself, what objections could my audience have? Now, if you look at the outline for the essay, you have your introductory section that should be 2 or 3 paragraphs long, approximately a page to a page and a half long. You have your body points where you're presenting your support for your argument, the supporting reasons for your argument, using the appeal method. What's your point? What's your evidence? What's your analysis of the evidence? What's your link of that evidence to your thesis statement? And so you have your 3 or 4 good points there that help build your argument. And then you should incorporate the opposing viewpoints right before your conclusion, which should be about your conclusion should be about a half a page to a 3/4 of a page. And when it comes to opposing arguments, you should incorporate at least one, preferably 2. Like, what are the 2 strongest arguments against your argument? What are the 2 strongest arguments against your own argument? Right, the opposing viewpoints. Anticipating possible objections, addressing possible objections to your argument requires the ability to think through a subject. So if I'm writing on the legalization of marijuana, and I'm arguing that the prohibition of marijuana should be ended and that the criminalization of marijuana should be lifted, so meaning that marijuana, cannabis, should be available for medicinal and recreational use. One possible objection is going to be that it's a gateway drug to harder drugs, right? That marijuana is a gateway drug to cocaine or heroin or other opioids, right? Another objection would be that teenagers will have more access to, or underage will have more access to using marijuana, or they'll use it at a greater rate. Okay, so I would anticipate those objections. If I was advocating, my topic was gun control, and I was advocating that we had enough laws on the books. But we just need to do a better job of closing the loopholes. Let's see. Well, let's just stick with the legalization of marijuana. I don't mean to babble. Okay, so in my argument essay, I would summarize the opposition's viewpoint openly and honestly. I would rely on a source. As I mentioned, you should incorporate one, at least one. Ideally, you'll incorporate two opposing viewpoints. And you could say, use these phrases. Some researchers have found that. Or critics often take an opposing view, holding that teenagers may have more access to marijuana if the prohibition on marijuana is lifted. I would point to that research. What's the source that says that? I would incorporate that. And then I would find my own research that says that, in states like Washington and Colorado, who have legalized marijuana recreationally, have they seen an uptick in teenagers abusing marijuana? And I would rely on that research. And so I would say critics often take an opposing viewpoint, holding that lifting the prohibition on marijuana will result in more teenagers using and abusing marijuana, and then incorporate that source that says that. Importantly, I would refute that opposing viewpoint, and that's the important part of it, right? You might be asking yourself, why would I introduce an opposing viewpoint, something that might convince my reader otherwise, against my own views, right? Well, you have to refute it. You have to argue against that. So, if I said, let's see, critics often take an opposing viewpoint, holding that that if the prohibition on marijuana is lifted, teenagers may abuse marijuana at a greater rate. I would incorporate that research, but I would refute it. And I would say, certainly this may seem like it's true, but we have that same issue with alcohol abuse. And the prohibition on alcohol is seen as a total failure. At the same time, or however, or on the other hand, nevertheless, we should seek to, however, there are studies conducted in Washington State that disprove this commonly held view. And I would point to that source, this source in the article, blah, 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 blah. The author, Kevin Smith, argues that proves that in states where the prohibition on marijuana has been lifted, teenage use does not increase in significant ways. That's the important part of it. You need to introduce the opposing viewpoint, but you have to be able to refute it. Okay? Of course, you want to be fair in counter arguments. To not be fair would damage your ethos as well, right? So, as you are finding and coming across opposing viewpoints, refer to this handout. I'm trying to keep these videos brief, and this one is under 9 minutes, and I'm going to keep it that way. If you have any questions, of course, contact me.